Hello! I got this comment on my last breakdown asking about the explosions. And you'd be forgiven for thinking you just hit it really hard with distortion, right? Well, kinda. It's trickier than you might think. If you've ever thrown something through distortion, even a really good quality recording, you know how easy it is to make it sound kinda shitty. All the low-level stuff gets brought way up as you push a sound through the ceiling, so any noise, hiss, and background sounds like birds and cars and ambience will be brought sharply into focus. Any problems with the recording, like boomy low end, become glaringly obvious. If any parts of the frequency spectrum are overrepresented, that gets exaggerated because it's the first thing that gets driven into distortion, and this can drastically change what comes out the other side. Never mind that distortion destroys your dynamics. It eventually becomes just a blob with no definition, a loud burst of straight-up noise with no detail or impact to it. Try it out. Listen really quietly so you're not tricked by how loud it is. Notice how there's a point of diminishing returns where it's not really hitting particularly hard anymore and instead becomes flat noise, which is probably the last thing you want when you're making an explosion. So, what do? We'll get to that. But first, let's zoom way out and talk about the macro shape of an explosion. If I tell you to make an explosion sound with your mouth, if you don't call the police, it'll probably go like a... So there's the k, and then the p, and then the... So just note that there are two main transients and then that crackly sound. That's sort of the basic shape you want to keep in mind when building an explosion. And you want to leave a good amount of space between those transients to get them to feel distinct. Okay, now back to those distorted crackles. The key here is to treat the signal before it hits the distortion. You want to really sharply define the edges of the sound. Gating, denoising, expansion, and transient shaping are your best friends here. You want it almost unnaturally clean. The more separation and definition you can get between the noise floor and the actual sound, the more rich and textured a sound you can get from the distortion. The more you create really defined edges, the further you can push it. So that's what I'm listening for with distortion, is texture. I don't have the exact signal chain I use because I bounced it out several times, but you can get in the ballpark with heavy denoising, maybe some de-reverb, maybe TransX to bring out the transients even more, then into distortion. And I like Melda's Wave Shaper because you can set it so that the lower level stuff that doesn't meet the threshold effectively gets gated out, leaving you with more of those crackly defined edges. And then you can use the transient shaper again after the distortion to exaggerate those distorted transients even more and bring the texture out. And because it doesn't really have any frequency dynamics anymore, meaning it takes up the entire frequency spectrum at all times, we can go back over it with some filtering to give it a nice tail that dies out and gives it a little bit more movement over time. And you could also go back in and give it a bit more volume dynamics too. There are tons of different ways to do this. You could do simple editing like this. You could bounce it and resample it. Or my personal preference is to use Serum FX because you can trigger the envelope section on a live sound, so you can basically reshape the envelope again post-distortion. Another thing worth mentioning is that you've inevitably sacrificed a lot of low-end punch by distorting it so heavily. So I also like to throw in a nice clean punchy layer to take the low-end space. So you can actually get rid of a lot of the low-end from the distorted layer and just have the clean synth doing that work. Boom Library's Enforcer is awesome for this. And then the last thing I want to mention is to just rein in your chaos a little bit. I talk about this more in depth in my Iron Age breakdown, but distortion creates a lot of harmonics and can get super harsh, so it can be beneficial to smooth it out a little bit, whether that's with dynamic EQ, multiband compression, etc. And that's pretty much it. I hope that's helpful, and goodbye!